The door slammed in my face. I stood there on the other side, my sister's suitcase in my hand, the cold metal of the lock clicking into place behind me. The hallway was dim, the fluorescent light above me flickering like it was about to give out. 3 days. I had 3 days before the world ended. I didn't knock. I didn't beg. I just picked up the suitcase and walked away. The elevator ride down was silent. The lobby was empty. I walked through the glass doors and into the afternoon sun, the heat of late summer pressing down on my shoulders like a weight. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew what was happening behind that door. Lily was kneeling in front of Grant, her voice soft and sweet, her fingers gentle on his bandages. She was apologizing for abandoning him, for being so thoughtless. She was telling him she'd never leave again. She was playing the part of the devoted caretaker, the saint who had saved a broken man. I'd seen it all before. But last time, I'd been the one kneeling, the one pressing cool cloths to his fevered forehead, the one whose hands had learned the careful dance of changing bandages on a wound that wouldn't heal. Last time, Lily had thrown the suitcase at my feet and run out the door, off to some resort where she'd planned to drink cocktails and ignore the news. She didn't know, back then, what was coming. None of us did. But now she knew. Now she remembered. And she wasn't going to let me have it again. I found a bench near the bus stop and sat down. The suitcase sat on the ground beside me, a cheap thing with a broken wheel and a faded floral pattern. Lily had packed it in a hurry, throwing in whatever she could grab. I unzipped it and looked inside. 2 dresses. A pair of heels. A swimsuit she'd never wear. Some makeup. The only useful thing was a small pouch with a few $100s in cash. I almost laughed. She'd sent me off to die with a swimsuit and lipstick. But she'd also given me something she didn't know about. She'd given me freedom. I reached into my pocket and closed my fingers around the ring. It was a simple thing, a silver band set with a pale green stone that looked almost like glass. My mother had given it to me years ago, before she died. She'd told me it had been her mother's, and her grandmother's before that. It's not worth much, she'd said, but it's lucky. She'd been more right than she knew. The stone hummed against my palm, a faint warmth that no one else could feel. I'd discovered its secret in my first life, during the darkest days of the end of the world. A pocket dimension inside it, a few acres of green grass and a spring of clear water that healed wounds and strengthened bodies. I'd used it to save Grant, to turn him from a broken invalid into a man who could lead armies, who could carve out a kingdom from the ruins of civilization. He'd turned it into a cage. I'd kept him alive. I'd poured my strength, my hope, my future into him. And in return, he'd built walls around me, told me I was too fragile to leave, too precious to risk. He'd kept me like a bird in a gilded cage, fed me sweet words and locked the door. Lily had come crawling back, broken and ruined, and she'd seen what I had. She'd seen the power, the adoration, the safety. She'd decided she wanted it for herself. And when she couldn't have it, when Grant chose me over her, she'd destroyed everything. The world had burned because she couldn't stand to see me happy. Now, she thought she could skip the suffering and claim the reward. She thought that as long as she was the one who nursed Grant back to health, she would be the one on his arm when he rose to power. She didn't understand that the power had never been his. I dropped the suitcase in a trash can on the corner. It wasn't worth carrying. I needed to find a place to stay. Somewhere safe. Somewhere far from the chaos that was coming. I walked to the nearest real estate office and found a young woman at the front desk, her face bright and eager, the kind of person who hadn't yet learned to be careful. She smiled when I walked in. "Hi. Looking for a place?" "Something in the suburbs," I said. "Quiet. Away from the city center. I don't need anything fancy, just safe." She nodded and pulled up a list of properties. We spent the next hour driving to different apartments, past clusters of strip malls and wide streets that would soon be filled with people running for their lives. I chose a small place on the edge of a development, a building that had been built with care but was just far enough from the city to stay safe. The windows overlooked a green field, and there were bars on the ground floor, not great for aesthetics, but good for what was coming. "It's a bit dated," the real estate agent said, looking around the empty apartment with a critical eye. It's perfect, I said. I signed the lease that afternoon, paid cash for 3 months up front. The real estate agent didn't ask questions. She was used to people with secrets, I guessed. Or maybe she just didn't care. As she was leaving, I reached out and touched her arm. A flicker of something passed through my vision, a future I'd already seen 1,000 times. Corpses in the streets. Screaming in the dark. But not for her. She'd die early, in the first wave, if I didn't stop it. Hey, I said. I have a weird question. What do you think about all these rumors about viruses and lockdowns? She laughed. Honestly, I think it's all a bit overblown. People love to panic. Maybe. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small bottle I'd prepared earlier. Regular water, nothing special. But just in case. Drink this. It's got vitamins. She looked at me like I was crazy, but she took the bottle and drank it. I walked away, hoping it would be enough. The spring's water could do a lot, but it couldn't do everything. That night, I sat in my empty apartment and watched the news. The anchors were calm, professional, talking about the usual things, crime stats, local politics, a feel-good story about a dog that had saved a cat from a fire. There was no mention of the coming apocalypse. They didn't know. No one knew. Except me. Except Lily. And the others like us, the ones who had crawled back from the dead with memories of fire and terror and loss. I turned off the TV and walked to the window. Outside, the lights of the suburb twinkled in the darkness. People were going about their lives, making dinner, watching TV, putting their children to bed. They had no idea what was about to happen. I knew I should feel sorry for them. I knew I should feel some kind of moral obligation to warn them, to save them. But I'd tried that once. I'd tried to be the hero. I'd given everything I had to people who didn't deserve it, and in the end, it had gotten me nothing but a cage and a betrayal. Not this time. The spring was mine. The space was mine. And I'd use it to save myself, and maybe a few other people. But first, I had to survive. And I had to make sure Lily didn't realize what she'd lost. I spent my first night in the apartment staring at the ceiling. The room was empty except for a mattress I'd bought from a thrift store, a few bags of supplies stacked in the corner, and the weight of everything I knew pressing down on my chest. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, the fire, the screaming, the way the world had crumbled into ash and bone. I saw Lily's face, twisted with hatred, as she led the horde toward us. I saw Grant's expression as he realized he couldn't save anyone. I saw the last moments of everything I'd ever known. And I saw the way it could have been different, if I'd been braver. If I'd trusted someone else. If I'd done what I was about to do now. I sat up and pulled the ring from my finger. It was warm to the touch, humming with a quiet energy that only I could feel. I held it up to the light, watching the pale green stone catch the glow from the street lamp outside. It looked like a cheap piece of costume jewelry, the kind you'd find in a pawn shop or at a flea market. But inside it was another world. A few acres of green grass. A spring of clear water that could heal wounds, cure illness, strengthen bodies. A pocket dimension that no one else could enter without my permission. It had been my salvation in my first life. It had been my prison in the end. This time, I was going to use it differently. I slipped the ring back onto my finger and made a decision. The next morning, I took a bus to the outskirts of the city. The building I was looking for was set back from the road, surrounded by chain-link fence and guard towers. It looked like a military installation, the kind of place that was designed to be unremarkable. The sign on the gate said something vague about logistics and supply chain management. I knew better. I'd done my research. I'd spent the previous night on the internet, tracking down every piece of information I could find about the National Guard unit stationed in the region. I'd cross-referenced addresses, satellite images, and news articles until I was sure I'd found the right place. The guard at the gate looked at me like I was crazy. This is a restricted area. You can't be here. I need to speak to someone in charge, I said. I have information about a national security threat. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his radio and murmured something I couldn't hear. A few minutes later, a woman emerged from the building. She was in her late 30s, with short cropped hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything. She wore the uniform of a military police officer, and she moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd been trained to handle dangerous situations. She said, her voice calm and professional. I'm Officer Daniels. Why don't you come inside and tell me what this is about? The room they put me in was small and windowless, with a table and 2 chairs and a camera in the corner. I sat in one of the chairs, my hands folded on the table, and waited. Officer Daniels sat across from me. She didn't look hostile, but she didn't look friendly either. She was doing her job, assessing the situation, trying to figure out if I was a threat or just someone who'd gotten lost. I'm going to tell you something that sounds impossible, I said. And I need you to listen to the whole thing before you decide I'm crazy. She leaned back in her chair. I'm listening. I took a breath. Then I told her everything. I told her about the apocalypse that was coming in 2 days. I told her about the virus that would turn people into monsters, about the chaos that would follow, about the millions who would die. I told her about the survivors who would rise from the ashes and the ones who wouldn't. I told her about the first life I'd lived, the one that had ended in fire and betrayal and death. I told her about the ring. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't laugh. She didn't call for help. She just looked at me with those steady, assessing eyes. You're going to need to show me something, she said. I nodded and slipped the ring off my finger. I held it up so she could see it. I'm going to take you inside, I said. It's going to feel strange for a moment, but I promise you'll be fine. I reached out and took her hand. The room dissolved. We appeared in the middle of a field. The grass was green and soft beneath our feet, stretching out in a gentle curve to the edge of a small grove of trees. The sky was a pale, clear blue, the kind of sky you only saw in paintings. In the center of the field, a spring bubbled up from the ground, the water so clear it looked like glass. Officer Daniels stumbled. She put a hand on my shoulder to steady herself, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Where? Inside the ring, I said. It's a pocket dimension. A separate space. I don't fully understand how it works, but it's real. You're standing in it right now. She knelt down and pressed her palm against the grass. Her fingers sank into the soil. She looked up at the sky, at the trees, at the spring. She was processing, cataloging, trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into any category she'd been trained to understand. The water, I said. It's not just water. It has properties. It can heal wounds, cure illness, strengthen the body. I've used it before. I know what it can do. I walked to the spring and cupped my hands in the water. I brought it to my lips and drank. The cool liquid slid down my throat, and I felt the familiar warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the fatigue and the fear. Officer Daniels watched me carefully. Then she walked to the spring and did the same. She drank. For a long moment, nothing happened. She stood there, her hand still cupped around the water, her expression unreadable. Then she looked down at her hand, at the small scar on her wrist that had been there for years. It was gone. The skin was smooth and pale, as if the wound had never existed. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something shift in her eyes. Not disbelief. Not dismissal. Something else. You're telling the truth, she said. Yes. She walked back to where I was standing, her stride steadier than before. Can you bring us back? I nodded and took her hand again. We returned to the interrogation room. The chairs were the same, the table was the same, the camera in the corner was the same. But everything was different. Officer Daniels sat down across from me. Her hand was trembling slightly. She was doing her best to hide it, but I could see it, and I could see her struggling to hold it together. I'm going to make a few calls, she said. Please wait here. The next few hours were a blur. I was moved to a different room, a larger one with comfortable chairs and a window that looked out over the base. People came in and out, military officials, government agents, scientists. They asked questions, took notes, examined the ring, examined me. They took blood samples and photographs and recordings. I answered everything. I showed them the space, the spring, the healing water. I let them test it, verify it, make sure it was real. And through it all, I stayed calm. This was the right choice. I knew it. In my first life, I'd tried to survive alone, hoarding my power and my secrets. I'd thought that was the only way to stay safe. I'd been wrong. The last person who came to see me was a man in civilian clothes. He was older, grey-haired, with a face that had seen too many wars and too much tragedy. He sat down across from me and took off his glasses, cleaning them slowly and methodically. "Raven," he said. "I'm General Morrison." "Sir." "I've been briefed on your situation. I've seen the evidence. I've spoken to the experts, and they've confirmed that your claims are credible." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine. "You understand that I'm taking a huge risk by believing you?" "Yes, sir." "If this is a hoax?" "It's not." He studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." I told him. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. I stayed on the base, in a secure facility, surrounded by people who were scrambling to prepare for what was coming. The military went into high gear, mobilizing troops, securing supplies, coordinating with state and local governments. A national emergency was declared. People were ordered to stay home. I kept my ring on my finger, using it to access the spring and provide water to a small team of scientists who were analyzing it, trying to understand its properties. They couldn't replicate it, of course, it was beyond their science, but they could learn to use it. On the 3rd day, the world ended. I felt it before I heard it. A tremor in the air, a shift in the pressure, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Then the screaming began. It came from everywhere at once, from the city, from the base, from the radios and televisions that were broadcasting the first images of the chaos. People attacking people, biting, tearing, spreading the infection. The virus was airborne, contagious, unstoppable. But it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Because we were ready. The military had set up checkpoints, curfews, evacuation routes. The hospitals had been fortified. The soldiers had been given a crash course in what to expect, what to do, how to survive. I watched from the command center, surrounded by screens and maps and strategists, as the first wave hit. It was brutal. It was terrifying. It was everything I'd told them it would be. But it wasn't the end. The first week was chaos. Not the kind of chaos where people ran screaming through the streets, although there was some of that too. The kind of chaos where everything you'd taken for granted suddenly stopped working. The power flickered and died. The water ran brown, then stopped altogether. The phone still worked, but they were clogged with desperate calls, voicemails, and messages from people who didn't know if they'd live to see tomorrow. I stayed at the base, in a secure room with a cot and a desk and a view of the perimeter fence. The military had set up a command center in the basement, a windowless warren of screens and maps and exhausted soldiers. General Morrison ran it like a man who'd been preparing for this his whole life. He hadn't. No one had. But he was good at pretending. "The infection is spreading faster than we projected," he said, studying a map of the region. "We've lost contact with 3 outposts in the last 6 hours. The survivors are retreating to the safe zones, but we can't hold them all." I stood in the corner, watching the screens. The images were grainy, shot from drones and helicopters, showing the horror that had descended on the world. Streets filled with bodies. Buildings on fire. The dead walking among the living. I'd seen it before. I'd lived it before. But seeing it again, knowing I'd had a chance to stop it and couldn't, was a special kind of torture. "The water," I said. "Have you started distributing it?" Morrison nodded. "We've got teams hitting the major population centers first. The diluted doses are helping. We're seeing lower infection rates in the treated areas. But there's not enough to go around. I can get more. I just need time." "I don't know if we have time." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The first images of the military's response appeared online a few days later. A soldier in full gear, standing in the middle of a burning street, his hands wreathed in flames as he faced down a horde of infected. The video went viral, spreading across the internet like wildfire. People who'd been hiding in their homes, convinced they were going to die, suddenly had hope. Is that real? How is that possible? Maybe the government knew more than they were telling us. I watched the videos with a strange mix of pride and dread. The soldiers were using the water I'd provided, the watered-down version of the spring's power that I'd helped them refine. They were becoming something new, something that might be able to survive the end of the world. But they weren't invincible. And the infected were getting smarter. The first time I saw Lily again was through a webcam. I'd set up a program to monitor my old apartment, a simple surveillance system that I'd installed in my first life and never bothered to remove. The footage was grainy, the sound crackly, but I could see enough. Lily was sitting in the living room, surrounded by the mountain of supplies she'd stockpiled. Grant was on the couch behind her, his legs still bandaged, his eyes still blind. He looked like a man who was slowly realizing he'd made a terrible mistake. "Drink this," Lily said, shoving a glass of water into his hands. He drank obediently. The water was clean, but it was nothing special, just tap water from the kitchen sink. I could see the hope in her eyes, the desperate belief that if she gave him enough water, enough food, enough care, he would transform into the powerful leader she remembered. It wasn't going to happen. Grant's powers had come from the spring in my first life. The water I'd given him, the healing I'd poured into his body, the weeks of careful treatment, that was what had made him strong. Without it, he was just a broken man in a broken world. Lily didn't know that. She thought she'd stolen my future. She thought she'd taken my place. She had no idea she'd taken my cage. The neighbors came on the 5th day. I watched through the camera as they gathered outside the apartment door, a crowd of exhausted, frightened people who'd run out of food and hope. The leader was a man named Derek, a burly guy who'd been a mechanic before the world ended. He was carrying a crowbar and wearing an expression that said he wasn't going to take no for an answer. "Open the door." Lily's face appeared in the peephole. I could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty she was trying to hide. "What do you want?" "You know what we want. Food. Water. Medicine. You've got mountains of it in there. It's not for you." "I don't care what it's for." Derek's voice was flat, hard. "You've been hoarding supplies while people are dying. I've got kids in the building who haven't eaten in 2 days. You're going to open this door, or I'm going to open it for you." Lily's hand trembled on the lock. She was trying to be brave, but I could see the calculations running behind her eyes. She had no weapons, no powers, no allies. Grant was useless. She was alone. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "Just give me a few more days." I said open the door. She opened it. The neighbors surged inside, a wave of desperate bodies that swept past her and into the apartment. They grabbed whatever they could find, cans of food, bottles of water, boxes of medicine. Lily stood in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, watching them take everything she'd hoarded. Grant was on the couch, his blind eyes staring at nothing. A woman snatched the blanket from his lap and he didn't react. A man knocked a pile of canned goods off the table and Grant didn't move. He was useless. He was weak. He was everything Lily had tried so hard to escape. When the neighbors were gone, Lily sat down on the floor amidst the ruins of her supplies and started to cry. It wasn't a pretty cry. It was ugly and raw, the kind of cry that came from a place so deep inside that it couldn't be faked. She was realizing, finally, that she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd chosen the wrong path. She'd tried to steal a future that was never hers. And now, she was going to pay for it. The post went live at midnight. I'd written it in the command center, hunched over a laptop while the screens around me showed the endless chaos of a world falling apart. It was a survival guide, simple, practical, the kind of thing I wished someone had given me in my first life. What to do if someone in your home turned. How to fortify a door. What supplies to prioritize. Which weapons worked best. I didn't expect it to do much. I just wanted to get the information out there, to help a few people who might stumble across it. But within an hour, it had gone viral. The military had been watching the internet closely, monitoring for panic, for misinformation, for any sign that the situation was spiraling out of control. They saw my post. They flagged it for review. And then, to my surprise, they didn't take it down. They're using it, General Morrison said, scrolling through the comments. They're pushing it to the top of the algorithms. This is going to save lives. I just wanted to help. I know. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something like respect in his eyes. You did. The comments were a mix of gratitude and fear and desperate questions. People wanted to know if the government had known, if there was a cure, if they were going to survive. I couldn't answer most of them. But the guide helped. It gave them something to do, something to focus on, a way to fight back against the helplessness. And then the jokes started. Someone found a video of Lily, old footage from the apartment, the moment when Derek and his crew had stormed the door. They'd edited it with music and captions, turning it into a meme. The richest girl in the apocalypse. Girl boss and her useless boyfriend. She got the supplies, but she forgot the common sense. I shouldn't have watched it. I should have turned it off, let Lily's humiliation fade into the noise of the internet. But I couldn't look away. Lily was sitting on the floor of the emptied apartment, her face streaked with tears, while Grant sat behind her like a useless lump. The camera caught her in the middle of a breakdown, screaming, crying, slamming her fists against the floor. And then she reached for her phone. I saw her fingers trembling as she typed, saw her face twist with rage as she hit send. A moment later, my phone buzzed. You did this. I know it was you. You're the one who posted that guide. You wanted them to find me. You wanted me to suffer. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, I didn't post your video. You did that yourself. Liar. You're always trying to ruin everything. You stole my life. You stole my future. You stole everything. Lily, I didn't steal anything. I just didn't let you steal from me. She didn't respond. But later that night, I checked the apartment camera again. She was sitting in the dark, holding her phone, scrolling through the comments on the viral video. Her face was blank, empty, like she'd finally run out of rage. She was broken. And she didn't even know it yet. The next few days were a blur of chaos and control. The military was pushing the diluted water across the country, using every resource they had to get it into the hands of people who needed it. The infection rate was slowing. The number of survivors was increasing. I spent my days at the spring, drawing water, filling containers, watching the level of the pool drop by inches. It was exhausting, draining, but it was worth it. Every drop I gave them was a chance to survive, a chance to rebuild. Grant's treatment continued. The scientists had taken a sample of the water from the spring and were analyzing it around the clock. They'd found a way to concentrate it, to make it even more powerful. They'd started testing it on volunteers, soldiers who'd been injured in the fighting. The results were nothing short of miraculous. I thought about Grant, about the way he'd been in my first life. The power he'd wielded, the empire he'd built, the cage he'd put around me. I thought about all the things I'd done for him, all the things I'd sacrificed. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt sorry for myself. Lily reached out again a week later. This time, she didn't call. She didn't text. She just sat in front of the camera I'd left in the apartment, looking straight into the lens, her eyes red and swollen. I know you're watching, she said. I know you've been watching this whole time. You probably think I'm pathetic. You probably think I got what I deserve. Her voice cracked. She waited a moment, composing herself. I don't care what you think. I don't care about any of it anymore. I just want to know one thing. She leaned closer to the camera, her face filling the frame. If you had told me, if you had warned me, would I have listened? I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought about the first life, the one where she'd hated me and destroyed everything. I thought about the second life, the one where she tried to take my place and failed. No, I said, even though she couldn't hear me. You wouldn't have listened. You never did. She was still watching the camera, waiting for an answer she'd never get. I reached out and turned off the screen. Some things were better left unsaid. The next few weeks were a blur of survival. The military had established a network of safe zones across the region, fortified compounds where survivors could live, work, and rebuild. The water from the spring was making a difference, more than I'd ever imagined. People were healing faster, fighting harder, living longer. I hadn't visited the apartment in weeks. I didn't want to see what had become of it, of her, of the life I'd left behind. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. Lily had been given a second chance, just like me. She'd been given the gift of knowledge, the power to change the future. And instead of using it to build something new, she'd used it to try to steal something old. She'd tried to take my place. She'd tried to take my future. She'd tried to take everything. And now, she had nothing. The call came at 3 a.m. I was in my quarters at the base, lying on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had been elusive for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw faces I'd lost, futures I'd failed to save. But tonight was different. Tonight, I couldn't stop thinking about Lily. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up without looking at the screen. Hello. Raven. Her voice was strange, flat, hollow, like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. I sat up, my heart starting to race. Lily. What's wrong? I did something bad. I didn't ask what. I didn't need to. I could hear it in her voice, the calmness that came after a storm, the emptiness that followed a decision too big to take back. Where are you? Still here. In the apartment. I never left. Lily. He's dead. I stopped breathing. Grant. I killed him. Her voice was still calm, still hollow. He tried to attack me. He made a knife out of ice. It was pathetic, really. Just a little shard, barely sharp enough to cut paper. But he thought he could kill me with it. Lily. I didn't mean to. I just reacted. And then he was on the floor and I kept hitting him, and when I stopped, he wasn't moving anymore. She laughed. It was a broken sound, the laugh of someone who'd lost the ability to feel anything but the emptiness inside. He was supposed to be strong. He was supposed to save me. I gave him everything I had. I fed him, I cared for him, I did everything right. But he never got better. He never became the man I needed him to be. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I thought if I just tried hard enough, I could fix him. I thought if I loved him enough, he would change. But he was always broken. He was always going to be broken. Lily, you need to listen to me. I know what you're going to say. You're going to tell me to come to you. You're going to tell me I can still be saved. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, shallow and uneven. But I don't want to be saved. Lily, please. Goodbye, Raven. The line went dead. I tried to call her back. 10 times, 20 times. She didn't answer. I tried to reach the military liaison in her area, the one I'd set up to monitor the apartment. No response. I was still trying to figure out what to do when the video call came through. It was Lily. Her face filled the screen, streaked with blood, her eyes wild and desperate. Behind her, I could see the apartment, the overturned furniture, the scattered supplies, the dark shape on the floor that I didn't want to look at. You were right, she said. About everything. You were always right. Lily, just tell me where you are. Don't you want to know what I did? Don't you want to know how I ended up here? I stayed silent. I tried to be you. I tried to take everything you had, the life, the power, the safety. I thought if I could just take your place, I would be happy. She laughed, a sharp, broken sound. But I was never going to be you. I was never going to have what you had. Because what you had wasn't something you took. It was something you were. Her voice cracked. I don't know how to be anything else. I don't know how to be better. I've always just taken. And now there's nothing left to take. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything. But no words came. I should have died in the first life, she continued. I should have stayed dead. But I came back, and I thought I could make it right. And all I did was make it worse. Lily. I'm sorry, Raven. I'm sorry for everything. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a knife. It was the same one she'd used on Grant, the blade still dark with his blood. Wait. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope you survive. She pressed the knife to her throat. I didn't look away. I couldn't. Lily, no. I love you, Raven. I never said it, but I did. She cut. I saw her eyes go wide, saw her mouth open in a final, silent gasp. The knife clattered to the floor. She slumped forward, her face disappearing from the frame. The screen went dark. I sat there for a long time. The phone was still in my hand, the screen blank and cold. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't think. I just sat there, staring at nothing. She was gone. Lily was gone, and I was alone. I thought about all the years we'd spent together, the childhood we'd shared, the arguments we'd had, the love that had always been there even when we couldn't see it. I thought about the first life, the one where she'd hated me so much that she'd destroyed everything. I thought about the second life, the one where she tried to take my place and failed. I thought about all the things I could have said, all the things I should have said. But it was too late. She was gone. I didn't go to her funeral. There wasn't one. The military handled the body, buried it in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of the base. I didn't ask to see it. I didn't want to remember her that way. Instead, I went back to the spring. I knelt beside the water and let myself cry. Not for Grant, he'd never deserved my tears. Not for the life I'd lost. For Lily. For the sister I'd failed, the sister who'd failed me, the sister who'd been so broken that she'd never known how to be whole. I cried until there was nothing left, and then I stood up and walked back to the command center. There was still work to do. General Morrison found me in the hallway later that day. Raven, he said. I heard about your sister. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Take some time off. Rest. We can manage without you for a few days. I don't want to rest. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, then. There's a shipment of water going out to the eastern zone. We could use an extra hand. I followed him to the loading dock and started to work. It was hard, physical labor, lifting, carrying, stacking. It felt good to have something to do, something to focus on besides the emptiness inside me. Raven. Morrison appeared at my side. You don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to carry everything on your own. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who's carrying a lot more than she should be. I didn't answer. I picked up another box and started walking. The water from the spring saved thousands. It saved cities and towns and villages, pulled survivors back from the brink and gave them a chance to rebuild. It helped the soldiers fight, gave them the strength to keep going. It was a miracle, a gift, a second chance for a world that had been on the edge of collapse. I saw the difference it made. I saw the faces of the people who'd been saved, the children who'd been healed, the families who'd been reunited. But I still felt empty. Lily's words haunted me. I don't know how to be anything else. I understood that better than I wanted to admit. I'd been the caretaker, the giver, the one who held everything together. I'd spent so long being strong for other people that I'd forgotten how to be weak for myself. Maybe that was the lesson I needed to learn. Maybe surviving the apocalypse wasn't just about staying alive, it was about learning to live again. The end of the crisis came gradually, not with a bang but with a quiet return to normalcy. The infection rate dropped. The safe zones expanded. People started to go outside again, to rebuild their homes and their lives. There were still dangers, there would always be dangers, but the fear was fading, replaced by something new. Hope. I stayed at the base for a while after that. I helped with the cleanup, the recovery, the endless work of putting the pieces back together. I was good at it. I'd had practice. But one day, I woke up and realized it was time to leave. Part 6, The Dawn. I left the base on a morning in early spring. The air was still cold, but there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there before, a promise of something new. The snow was melting, the roads were clearing, and for the first time in months, I could see the sky without smoke or ash clouding it. I didn't have much. A backpack with a few changes of clothes, some water, and the ring on my finger. It was enough. It was more than I'd had when I started. General Morrison came to see me off. He was in full uniform, his face tired but calm. He'd aged years in the last few months, but there was a steadiness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure. You could stay here. We could use you." I shook my head. "I've done my part. It's time for me to find out what comes next." He didn't argue. He just reached out and shook my hand. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find us." "Thank you, General. For everything." "Thank you, Raven. For everything." I walked out of the gate and into the world. The city was different now. The streets were quiet, the buildings empty, the silence thick and strange. But there were signs of life everywhere. Garden plots in the front yards, laundry hanging from windows, the distant sound of children playing. People were still here. They were surviving. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. I walked for days, through towns and villages and the ruins of cities, following roads that had been cleared by the military's recovery teams. I helped people where I could, treating wounds, sharing food, listening to their stories. I didn't tell them who I was or what I'd done. I just let myself be useful. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like the first step toward something new. I found her in a small settlement on the edge of the forest. She was young, maybe 12 or 13, with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. She was sitting alone on the porch of a ruined house, holding a doll with no head. I stopped. "What's your name?" I asked. She looked up at me. "My name doesn't matter. No one calls me by it anyway." "Then what do people call you?" "Nothing. They don't call me anything." I knelt down in front of her. "What if I called you something? What if I called you Lily?" She stared at me for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right. You can call me that." I sat down next to her, and we stayed there for a long time, watching the sun sink below the trees. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was a start. I stayed in the settlement for a few weeks, helping where I could, learning what I needed to know. The girl, Lily, grew to trust me, slowly, cautiously, like a feral cat who'd been burned before. But eventually, she started to open up. She told me about the attack, the loss of her family, the months she'd spent alone in the woods. She told me about the nightmares, the hunger, the fear. She told me about the moment she'd given up hope. "But you came," she said. "You found me." I didn't know how to respond to that. I'd been looking for something, a purpose, a path, a reason to keep going. I hadn't expected to find her. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the things we found when we weren't looking were the ones that mattered most. I was in a small town on the coast when I saw the first plane. It was a helicopter, painted in the colors of the new government, flying low over the rooftops. People came out of their houses to watch it pass, their faces turned up toward the sky. There was no fear in their eyes, only wonder. The helicopter landed in the town square, and a woman in uniform climbed out. She looked familiar. It took me a moment to place her. Officer Daniels. She was older now, her hair shorter, a new scar on her cheek. But her eyes were the same, sharp, steady, seeing everything. "Raven," she said. "Daniels. You don't have to be alone, you know. You're not a stranger anymore." I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so long being invisible, being forgotten, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "I found a girl," I said. "She needs help." "Then bring her with you. We have room for everyone now." I looked at the settlement, at the people who'd become my family over the past few months. I looked at the girl, Lily, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, her eyes fixed on the helicopter. "I'll think about it," I said. But I already knew what I was going to do. I left the settlement a month later, with the girl by my side. We traveled together, through the ruins and the rebuilding, the grief and the hope. We found other survivors, people who'd been scattered by the storm, looking for a place to belong. We built something new, something that was neither the world that had been nor the world that was coming. It was hard. It was terrifying. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever done. And when I looked back at the life I'd lived, at the sister I'd lost, at the future I'd tried and failed to change, I didn't feel regret. I felt gratitude. The final night before we reached the new settlement, I sat by the fire with the girl. She was older now, stronger, the shadows fading from her eyes. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Of what?" "Of what comes next." I thought about it. I thought about all the things I'd been afraid of, the end of the world, the loss of everyone I loved, the weight of carrying everything on my own. I thought about all the things I'd survived. "No," I said. "I'm not scared anymore." She looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Trust. Belief. A future. "Good," she said. "Because I'm not scared either." The new settlement was built on the ruins of the old. But it was different. The people who lived there were different, tougher, kinder, more determined to build something that would last. They'd learned from the mistakes of the past. They were ready to do better. I walked through the gates, the girl at my side, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, honest, unshakable hope. The world hadn't ended. It had just begun again. And this time, I was going to be part of it. Extra one, the last light. She never told anyone about the dream. Not the military doctors who monitored her sleep patterns, not the psychologists who tried to help her process the trauma, not even General Morrison, who had become something like a friend in the months since the world ended. The dream was hers alone. In it, she was back in the apartment. Not the one she'd lived in with her sister, the one that had been stormed by desperate neighbors and stripped of everything valuable. The one before. The one from the first life, when she was young and foolish and believed that if she just tried hard enough, she could save everyone. It was always the same dream. Lily was there, sitting on the floor of the apartment, surrounded by the supplies she'd hoarded. Her hair was tangled, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She was holding a knife, the same knife she'd used to end her life. But in the dream, she didn't use it. "Raven," she said. "I'm sorry." I stood in the doorway, watching her. In the dream, I could move, could speak, could do all the things I hadn't been able to do in real life. "It's okay," I said. "I forgive you." She looked up, and for a moment, her face was the same as it had been when we were children. Open, hopeful, unguarded. "Really? Really?" She set down the knife. The apartment around us began to fade, dissolving into light. The last thing I saw was her smile. And then I woke up. I didn't tell anyone about the dream. I kept it close to my heart, a secret that belonged only to me. It didn't fix anything. It didn't change the past. But it helped. The crisis ended, but the work didn't. There were still infected to clear, communities to rebuild, survivors to find. The military had established a permanent base on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling complex that housed thousands of people. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe. I stayed there for a year, helping with the recovery efforts. I worked alongside the soldiers, the scientists, the volunteers who'd come from all over the country to help. I felt useful. I felt needed. I still thought about Lily every day. The guilt was still there, buried deep beneath the surface. I'd tried to save her. I'd tried to warn her. But in the end, she'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. I didn't know if I'd ever stop wondering what I could have done differently. The first time I left the base, it was spring. The snow had melted, the roads had been cleared, and the military had finally given the all clear for non-essential travel. I packed a small bag and took a transport truck to the edge of the city. It was strange to see it again. The buildings were still standing, but they were empty now, hollow shells that had once held lives and dreams. The streets were quiet, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. There was a beauty in the decay, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. I walked to the old apartment building. It had been abandoned for months, its windows shattered, its doors hanging loose on their hinges. I climbed the stairs to the third floor and found my way to the door. Someone had boarded it up. I pried the boards loose with my bare hands and stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. The furniture had been overturned, the supplies scattered, the walls covered in graffiti. But I could still see traces of what it had been, the place where I'd grown up, the place where everything had started. I found Lily's room. It was the smallest room in the apartment, a closet-sized space that had once been filled with posters and clothes and teenage dreams. Now it was empty, stripped bare by scavengers and time. I sat down on the floor and let myself cry. I cried for the sister I'd lost. I cried for the childhood we'd shared. I cried for all the things we'd never said to each other, all the chances we'd missed. And then I stood up, wiped my eyes, and walked away. I never came back to the apartment after that. There was nothing for me there anymore. The ghosts had been laid to rest, the memories put to peace. I was ready to move on. I went to the coast next. The ocean was beautiful, endless, a reminder that the world was bigger than the city I'd left behind. I rented a small cabin and spent my days walking on the beach, watching the waves, thinking about the future. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I'd spent so long surviving that I'd forgotten how to live. But I was learning. Slowly, painfully, I was learning. I wrote letters to the people I'd met during the crisis, the soldiers, the scientists, the volunteers. I told them about my journey, about the things I'd seen and the things I'd learned. I didn't talk about Lily. Not yet. But maybe someday. I started a garden. It was a small thing, just a few plants on the windowsill, but it gave me something to care for, something to watch grow. I tended it every day, watering it, talking to it, treating it like a living thing. Because it was. Because everything was. I still thought about the dream. I still thought about Lily. But the guilt was fading, replaced by something softer, something like acceptance. She'd made her choices. I'd made mine. And in the end, we'd both done the best we could. The garden grew. The world healed. And I learned to live again. Extra 2, the general's daughter. She was the first person I told about the dream. It was a year after the crisis ended, and I was back at the base, helping with the final phase of the recovery effort. I'd just finished a shift at the clinic, treating the last of the infected, when I found her in the hallway. She was young, barely out of her teens, with a face that was too old for her age and eyes that had seen too much. She was carrying a small bag and looking lost. "Are you okay?" I asked. She looked up. "I'm looking for General Morrison. He's in a meeting. It might be a while." She nodded, but she didn't move. I gestured to a bench against the wall. "Do you want to sit?" She sat. Her name was Maya. She was one of the survivors from the Eastern Zone, a small town that had been hit hard in the first wave. She'd lost her parents and her brother, had been on her own for months before the military found her. "I don't know why I came," she said, staring at her hands. "I just felt like I needed to see him. The general. I needed to thank him. He's just doing his job." "I know. But he saved my life. He saved everyone." I didn't say anything. I'd heard that kind of talk before, the hero worship that followed the crisis. But Maya wasn't worshipping. She was just grateful. I told her about Lily. Not all of it. The parts about the apocalypse and the ring and the spring were still classified. But the parts about my sister, about the choices she'd made and the things she'd done. She was in a bad place, I said. She couldn't see a way out. And in the end, she didn't find one. Maya listened quietly. When I finished, she said, "Do you miss her?" "Every day." "Do you think she's at peace?" I thought about the dream. Lily's smile, her apology, the light that had surrounded her as she faded away. "Yes," I said. "I think she is." Maya stayed at the base for a few weeks. She helped in the clinic, learning the basics of medical care from the nurses who'd survived the crisis. She was a quick learner, determined, always asking questions. I watched her grow, watched her find purpose in the work. One day, she came to me with a proposal. "I want to go back," she said. "To my hometown. I want to help rebuild." "Are you sure?" "I've been thinking about it for a while. There's nothing for me here. But there might be something for me there. I wanted to tell her to stay, to keep her safe in the base where she'd always have food and shelter and protection. But I knew that wasn't what she needed. Take care of yourself, I said. She smiled, a real smile, the first one I'd seen from her. I will. She left the next week. I didn't hear from her for months. When she finally wrote, it was a letter. She'd made it to her hometown. The rebuilding was hard, but the community was coming together. She'd found a purpose, a reason to keep going. She ended the letter with a promise. I'm going to be okay. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I thought about Lily, about the choices she'd made and the ones she hadn't. I thought about the life she could have had, if she'd been able to see the way out. But I thought about Maya too, about the way she'd turned her grief into purpose, her pain into strength. She'd found a reason to keep going. Maybe that was the lesson. Maybe surviving wasn't just about staying alive. It was about finding something worth living for. I kept the garden. I kept the cabin by the coast. And I kept the memory of Lily, not as a source of guilt, but as a reminder of the things I'd survived and the person I'd become. The world was rebuilding. The future was uncertain. But I was ready for it.